Vamos falar em inglês, porque nós somos em inglês. Welcome to everybody. Thank you so much for coming. And we are here for the third appointment of Breathing Printout, a series of conversation about self-publishing and self-care. We decided to invite 5 editorial projects or magazine or books. We actually struck our attention for their attention to the care of the self. Some of them because we're trying to improve the desire or the pleasure coming from the sex, and also the spirituality through their books, through their publication, and we found it pretty important in a moment like that. And some others because they were trying to improve one's personal research without any labels or restriction, and so trying to push this kind of freedom of expression. And that's why we invited a magazine as Hammam, who is focused on the bath and letting go, or publishing houses as Ignota books. And today we are pretty happy to have the writer of one of the Ignota books that is unknown language that you can find on the shelf. And it's actually a book written with forehand, I can say, written, because it's by Lemmey, but also Hildegard of Bingen. And actually the co-author of Hugh is not here because it's 800, she lived 800 years ago. And she was an abbess from this Benedictine monastery. And she was such a prolific writer and composer, and she actually was the first woman, correct me if I'm wrong, the first woman who received the permission to write about her visions, because her visions were pretty important since the very child age. And so she also got, actually she's saint, if I'm not wrong. She got, from Pope Benedict.
Yeah, she's actually at the doctorate church.
Okay.
I think on Wednesday.
Okay. Oh, okay. And so yeah, that's the book about. And also there is an interesting story written by, I'm going to read the name to pronounce it well, Banu Kapil, is an introductory story. And there's also an afterword by Alice Holtz, which I strongly suggest if you don't know Hildegard, because it's a very interesting bio and a way also to read about her life. And we are here with the author, so I'm sure we can talk a bit about the book and make some questions, so feel free to ask whatever. And we are also going to read part of the book, a piece of the book. So I hope you will enjoy. I forgot. I also wanted to thank our sponsor to make this possible, especially Colisao Maria Armando Cabral and DJ Artes, and of course Collezione Rubino, who supported us and the project of Breathing Printout and its realization. So that's all. Thank you. Thank you all for that.
Thank you. Yeah, I thought maybe I'd read a short extract just so you can get a flavour of the book. To put it into context, at this part, the narrator lives in a city where the end of the world has just occurred, or is in the process of unfolding, and she's confused about this process. And so this short bit is sort of her talking about the city as she finds it. Sickness makes a foreign country of you. Isolated and without language, I turned over in bed to see myself in the mirror, but I didn't recognize this stranger. As sweat began to form on my skin and I became more helpless, I felt less ashamed of turning to her in my dreams and asking for help. I wasn't, as far as I could tell, alone, but the body beside me was not mine. I pressed a finger to my arm to feel for a vein. The sensation of blood pumping felt through the finger, also pumping blood, is eerie to me, unbodied. The finger leaves its impression, a white island with a burning red. In truth, the city was far from eradicated. Prophecies prove inaccurate. Even an occupying authority cannot totally erase a centuries-old urbanity from the map. or rather the city may disappear from the map, but in memory the territory holds hard, too hard to ever dissipate. For the people, it will last as long as they do, and there were plenty of citizens left. In the months that followed, we saw both a return to normality, meals needed to be made and babies delivered, and a slow reorganisation of the way the city functioned. The limits of the Holy Occupation reached only to the new city walls, ramparts hundreds of years old, new as a relative term. The masonry reinforced and repaired as they reached upwards. The city of God was manifest, the gates locked, and order was gradually returning through the judicial contagion. It was clear that the initial assessments were vastly over-optimistic. Resistance was tougher and more insidious than expected. Sin was not just a way of life, but a mode of being for most of the population. Part of me felt a degree of sympathy for the occupiers. They were now in a position our department had been in for years, firefighting systemic problems, while increasing frustration resulted in greater brutality. But the same casual attitude towards sin betrayed a helpful characteristic in the people. They were malleable to change. My offices were closed immediately, or rather they failed to open. I assume many, if not most, of the central administrative building staff were taken in the first strike. The subsequent sweeps would have picked up most of the rest, aided by a slew of willing informants with axes to grind and grudges against the former regime. Moments of revelation are brief and ecstatic, freeing the realm of imagination and possibility. This revolutionary fervour is better known as lawlessness. It is at first euphoric, because the wildest ideas can prosper and new forms can be applied to all relations, now unencumbered, but no revolution clears away existing forms entirely. Instead, they breed malignantly, as though the old ways had deprived them of oxygen and they're released to the wind. They are parasitic on past bitterness. Even, or especially, the most utopian people clash with contagions. And so it was that God's most conscientious snitches had lists pressed into his cold left hand within hours. At night I heard cries. Their sharp, persistent sound made me remember a demonstration of truck drivers back in a time of pressing political crisis. Normally the quiet workers, who passed through the hinterlands in the darkness to deliver the fresh produce that would magically appear on stalls in the morning. For their protest, they ground to a halt and pounded their horns. If a single horn produced a sprightly part, collectively they culminated in an unbearable cacophony, the kind that carried over the rooftops and up stairwells, through your vibrating fingertips and down your spine. Dignity was what they had scrawled in their truck bands. These nighttime cries belonged to the tortured. When the noise of the re-emerging street activities, half commerce, half crime, had died out for the evening, the baying began to rise from the basements. The sounds of pain and undelivered mercy were carried on the evening breeze. Each wail combined with the next in a softly penetrating drone. I know not what they were trying to extract: confession, details of the civic administration, repentance, or all three. But each night, as I tried to drop off to sleep, I felt certain I could recognise certain voices, baritone or with a peculiar pitch, and feared for the old friend, colleague, or comrade who had been picked up in a sweep. It was a devilish fear, experienced no doubt by everyone, even the snitches, or especially them. The terror came from both the imagination of the action that caused each yelp and the acknowledgement that you could be the next to bleed. Angels worked these torture chambers and patrolled the streets. They could be seen descending from the flaming sky, winged glittering with 1,000 blinking eyes that reflected the light of heaven onto the darkened city. Their sparkle was but a prelude for the cruelty they were about to enact. I would close off the lamp in my kitchen and stand in front of the window and see them drift down like falling pollen dropped by suffocating clouds. Yes, I previously worked within the city administration. Even when judged against the new regime, this bureaucratic body had a reputation for unethical behaviour, corruption, and to an extent cruelty, although I feel like these allegations fade in light of the later brutalities. As I saw it, we ran a system that prioritised those who, actively or passively, believed in order as the beating heart of any civilised achievements. Outside the city walls was evidence enough of life without administration. Beyond the farming colonies that stretched into the fertile valleys of the hinterlands were areas of banditry and battles, malarial swamps, incestuous fortified homesteads, sickness and insurrection. In the wake of droughts and floods, these subversive scenes were left over, remnants of a once Christendom. And why did we need to stretch our farming lands further down long valleys, fed by highways and railroads taming that rough land? Because each year, more and more of the outside inhabitants would appear at our gates, demanding safety and security, wanting a claim to prosperity and civilization. It was our duty and honor to provide the liberty of a free city, and it was our responsibility to ensure a stable basis for such a life. Any mother knows that her children's hands must be clean before they sit at the dinner table. This mother is not one who holds their dirty fingers beneath scalding and soapy water, no matter how often little brutes may call her a tyrant. Likewise, my pens and paper, with their efficient instructions, with a scrubbing brush and the suds, the surgeries and the medical vans, the bleach and the chlorine, you understand. My time in the service was not, therefore, something I look back on regretfully. The new regime had little time for clean hands. They needed no hygienic chemicals. Sunlight is at best disinfectant, we used to hear from the City Hall, a fallacy to a medical professional such as myself, though I appreciated their metaphorical power. Well, now they had all the sunlight they could wish for and more. From the thousand eyes of the angels, ultraviolet rays could blister skin and fill the trenches, grooved in the hillside with fire. Just as your watch was on the verge of fusing to your flesh, the ice-cold wind abruptly blew. Worse, the overpowering fumes from the burning trenches of your bodies could incapacitate thought. Knowledge seeped through your flesh. Experience atrophies like the skin on your bones. We moved in a sheep-like stupor, in obedient response to this obedient terror.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, cool. Actually, yeah, I was, the first thing that left me be enchanted by the book is the four-hand writing. And I was wondering, just to get more into that, how this collaboration starts between you and Hildegard, how did everything start?
Well, it was very unusual for me because it was a commissioned book,
Okay.
which I think.
Can you just, sorry to interrupt, just a little bit higher.
Yes.
please?
Okay.
It's
There's
not
also
here,
a
well.
seat here if you want.
Yeah, but even here we don't hear very well because I have noise.
Maybe now we can close this.
Yeah.
Because it's more than
Wait. Okay. We'll try to scream out loud. I was wondering. I was asking you how did this collaboration start with Hildegard and what I asked.
Yeah, it was an unusual project because it was a commissioned book, which is I think quite rare for novels. The publisher came to me and with the idea and said we've had this idea of we want to produce a book where that makes Hildegard's writings accessible for a modern contemporary audience.
Mm-hmm.
Because her writings are amazing and extremely powerful, very, very vivid, but the form is very dense. There's a lot of them, and they're very repetitious, and also a lot of them are set within the context of medieval Europe. If you don't have that background necessarily, it can be hard to interpret what she's trying to say in terms of politics and morals and religious theology. So they approached me and said, "Would you like to write this book?" And that's about the extent of it. They gave me all her writings, and they sort of highlighted certain things that they thought they'd like to be included, because what they wanted was something that encapsulated her cosmology, which is very specific, and a few certain other aspects. So basically, I had all these texts, and I had to think, how can this be turned into a hopefully compelling narrative for a modern audience? So yeah, that's how the work came about, and that's why it's sort of explicitly co-authored. It's because they said, well, because Riley, it's her ideas underpinning the book.
Yeah, it's actually great, as you said, that it's so vivid what she wrote, because I had the vision to grab something of her at the university by chance, and then it was such a pioneeristic way to express for a woman, and it's interesting that you felt somehow the urgency to translate it in the translated, but it's actually difficult to come across Hildegard's text, and if you are like someone who can help you to navigate that word is, I think, super important.
Yeah, I think also the thing is about Hildegard's work is, although, well, to an extent it's co-authored, is she wrote it with, so for those who don't know, Hildegard from a very young age was put into a convent and was raised, I think for the first 10 or 15 years of her life, pretty much in isolation with one other woman. And very early on she started to have visions that would come on her after a prolonged period of illness, something like that was very, very stressful for her. And then when she sort of succumbed to the visions, laid down and then wrote them down, the symptoms of her illnesses would be relieved. So they're very, very potent anyway, and she felt like she'd been cursed almost by these visions. She didn't welcome them at all. And it was only when she was a bit older, in her 30s, that she then went to the religious authorities and expressed her the fact that she'd been having these visions and asked whether she could write them down, because that was the thing that relieved her illness. And at that point, the authority said yes, but it was an extremely brave thing to do, because in the context of medieval Europe at the time, there was a whole series of heresies that were sweeping Europe. Constant visionaries, mystics, whose visions were politically very destabilizing. They would lead sort of mini crusades. It was very, very chaotic. So for her to go and say this, she was theoretically putting herself in a position of maybe being executed or at the very least excommunicated. It would be very difficult for her. And she was extremely lucky that they said, okay, yeah, these are actually visions from God. And so once they were rubber stamped by the church, she suddenly accumulated a huge amount of political power, because she was seen as someone who could communicate with God. But yeah, she didn't write them down herself. She actually had a scribe who I think was contributed towards the literary shaping of them, because they're quite a lot of the visions, especially in Skiddas, which is one of the main visionary texts, are quite formal, and they tend to have three parts, where she describes what she saw, and then she describes the symbology of the things that she saw, and then she describes again, but in terms of the wider theological cosmology. So yeah, I think that she was herself also engaged in polyvocal sort of forms of creativity, and also of course in her music. She's the first named composer in Western musical culture, and I don't know anything really about music, but I've spoken to a musicologist about it. He says that actually her work was only really could only be created through working with choirs.
Okay.
So actually in her choral works, there was these many creative contributions that sort of were fed into her.
Okay.
Her work.
Yeah. So yeah, but in fact I read that there are many compositions. I mean, it's actually the woman with more composition from the Middle Ages, if I'm not wrong. I mean, written composition.
It wouldn't surprise me, it's a lot.
Yeah. No, that was another thing. She was polymath actually, and that's incredible.
Yeah. And she was a doctor of sorts. She engaged in a sort of medical practice, as it could be described at the time. And a lot of her writings are also medical in nature, so that's something I tried to feed into the book in places. The main character here works in public health.
Yeah, true. And in fact, as you were saying, also the name of the publishing house is Ignota Books. It's actually coming from the story of Hildegard, because she also invented a structured language and a no language, because it was made of symbols, and so it was pretty impressive. Also, her need to invent a proper language to communicate. There are people who say that she probably invented to keep something secret, but maybe it was just another way to express her genius. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's never been decoded, so
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
that's wonderful.
I don't know if you have any questions. Yeah.
I would be interested in the sources you used for writing the book. I heard you said before that Ignota provided you with a
Yeah.
pack of works, I imagine translated from German into English.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you have any reference in the book about the sources, or could you give me some?
Yeah, I think actually they're noted. I can just check. Yeah, they're noted because
Okay.
there's quite a lot of.
Okay.
When I was writing the book, actually, there's numerous sections where I want to include her own words. So in italics, there's quite a lot
Okay,
from
I'll
her
check
own work,
that.
and also from the Bible. Yeah. But the main source I used for the visions was Scivias, which is this huge book of visions. But there's also Physica, which is her medical writings as well, which is another one too, as well, and various other ones. Causa e Curae, which is also a medical work as well.
Out of curiosity, if you, before this specific commission, had engaged, I don't know your background, but if medieval mysticism or medieval theology were an interest before, or was something you kind of like started digging into for this project?
Yeah, I was really interested in sort of early modern mysticism, like during the English Revolution, there was this rise in mysticism in England that was very, very political and caused a sort of new branch of the Reformation, but never really medieval mysticism. But I read a very interesting book while researching this called it's by Norman Cohn, Something of the Millennium, The Pursuit of the Millennium, which is, if you're interested in medieval mysticism, it's one of the best books about it. It's a history book that sort of traces 600, 700 years of European mysticism, pre-Reformation, and its political consequences. And for me, that was really fascinating as well, because you really get the impression that before the Reformation, there was 100, 1,000 chances of Reformation. There was these constant pushing against the power of the church, which is why it could have gone so badly for Hildegard. And also, I think you can understand, although she was very much part of the church and contributed a lot to sort of church theology, there's aspects of her life that were very much challenging to the church, and especially her theology. And at one point, she was almost excommunicated at the height of her career, very near her death. She was an abbess in her own right. She controlled this abbey, and the abbey was regarded as very on the edge of acceptability. The nuns there were always dressed in white, with long flowing hair, and they were producing this music and things like this. And she was in some sort of political challenge from the church at that point, where they actually banned her from the entire convent from singing. And then threatened to excommunicate her as well, because, and the entire reason was that she buried a man in the graveyard of the abbey who had been excommunicated, and she refused to let the church dig it. So yeah, she's an interesting figure.
I'm interested in knowing a little bit more about the commissioning process, because how did it work? Were you asked to write a piece of fiction, or was that your decision, or how did you navigate that request? Because it is a very special and specific request.
Yeah, the two people who run Ignota Books, Sarah Shin and Ben Vickers, I've known for a long time. They're very, very interesting people, and I've worked with them in the past in various other projects. But my other fiction is very unlike this. It's very modern, but it also has aspects of mysticism and revolution and drugs and queerness and things like this. So I think they approached me because they wanted, they came and said they wanted fictional book. I know quite specific, they said 40,000 words on this date, this many chapters almost. And they gave me the highlighted text. In the end, not all those passages were built into the book. But I quite like working that way. I've ghostwritten stuff before, and it's quite a satisfying process to have a collaborative process where there's some structure and form given to you in advance is for me a lot more fun to write than someone saying, write a book about whatever you want.
Yeah.
And it's a nightmare situation.
Yeah, no limits.
Yeah, the limits like encourage more creativity, I think.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, it was quite specific.
And how did you go about it? Because again, being so specific, and then you mentioned that you like the kind of narrowing down of possibilities, but how did you manage your own voice within this narrative in which two voices exist, given that one of them is a voice, but it is kind of a silent voice, in the sense that, she can't say anything about the collaboration.
Yeah. First of all, I really threw myself into just reading her for a long time.
Yeah.
A couple of months, largely just reading her. And I got a sense for her voice and the way she structured her writing. And then there were some really amazing scenes, which, because her visions were quite narrative and very weird. And there was so much which was so vibrant. I was like, okay, this has to be, and this has to be, and this has to be. And her sort of depictions around cities, especially. So that starts to give me a sort of sense of it. And then from reading her stuff, I thought the way to include her voice is to try and write, to an extent, the same sort of language, so that she uses, like the same syntax, like the same references of the Bible and your prophetic writings that I'd read. And then when it came to the writing process, to sit down, I sat down every single day. I asked a friend actually who's a lot more religious than me how I should approach it. And they said, first of all, I need to go on a pilgrimage. So I went to Montserrat, which is this holy mountain in Catalonia, and bought some candles. And then I took the candles back, and every day I'd sit down to work and I'd light the candle and say a prayer, and then write. And it worked. It was actually the easiest writing experience I've ever had, which is not what I expected when I started. Yeah. I think there's like something interesting within a lot of mystic writings and a lot of prophecies, which is her writing is, I find very interesting, because at times you read it and you're like, this is the most arrogant person I've ever read in my entire life. The hubris is just like coming off the page. But then you realize, oh, she thinks, or her writing is ventriloquizing God. Like, it's not her. So she's referring to herself as humble, but then making these extravagant claims about the world and her understanding of the world. And she switches between her voice and God's voice quite a lot as well. So that was also part of it, is to realize that actually the process of mysticism is actually about removing yourself as having a writer's voice.
Did you do that?
I tried to. I don't think so, because I'm not motivated by the same things that her. I haven't had those visions in the same way. So. But also, having said that, I was raised in a Quaker. I don't know if you know Quakerism, Quaker church. So I was raised in a Quaker background, which is in itself a form of Christian mysticism. And in Quaker meetings, you sit in silence until God moves you to speak. And so the concept of it was not alien to me, because it's something that, as a child, like I experienced other people doing, and sometimes felt the need to do myself as a child. Yeah, I felt sort of in my bones. I understood what the sensation of those people, how they were feeling about it, or something.
And you actually try also to keep the polyphony, this polyphony that was in Hildegard, and of course of the book itself, but also including the story at the beginning and the afterwards at the end. So you tried somehow to give a polyphony, to the entire book.
Yeah.
How did it happen? You felt like the urgency to include also another story and a biography about it?
No, that was also the publisher's idea.
Okay.
Yeah. I know both Alice and Barney's work quite well, but I didn't speak to them about it before writing, and they didn't see my text before writing it. So, yeah, the publisher is the god in this situation.
He's the god behind.
Yeah, it feels a bit in a good way like you were just joining a party, because you also already like God, her, the script, the scribe, and the editor. So it's kind of like that kind of collective.
Yeah,
it's very present.
It's actually, I think, much more. I think actually, it's very like actually how books are made. But normally that whole within commercial fiction especially, the whole process is very much obscured, and when the book arrives, it's just the one name on the front, and it's like this genius who's giving it to you. Whereas obviously, the role of the editor is and also various other people in the process is key in commercial fiction anyway. And actually, it also has there's another voice who is in the book, like it's the editor I worked with on line edits, like very sort of technical editor, Hannah Gregory, who was really key as well in shaping certain aspects of it.
Of course, I was going to.
Of course.
Yeah, she always has questions.
I have tons of no. This is a silly question, but I was thinking about it as you were speaking. Did you ever think what Hildegard would think of this book if she could read it?
Yeah, she hates it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
She hates it.
I think so. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Why?
You feel it.
Yeah. No, I think. I mean, we come from two different worlds.
Yeah.
But largely because the main character in the book, who isn't ever named as Hildegard, who's obviously drawn some influences from her, but the main character is not Hildegard, but there's some similarities in it. Engages in a sort of same-sex relationship at some point that's not actually sexual, but is intimate. And having read Hildegard's writing on sexuality, I think she would not like to be portrayed in that light. but also, I mean, she's also a very contradictory person, because her writing she used a lot of metaphors to do with sex, to do with women, like the whore is the figure who's like a constant recurring figure in her writings, and the relationship between like people who sell sex or sex workers and every type of sin, and almost like as an allegory for Satan is very, very present in her writing. But at the same time, she clearly knows a lot about human sexuality, especially for a nun. There was this sort of inspiration thinking like, well, what could a sexual, like, queer writing about her look like? Because another first is that she was the first person the first the first description of the female orgasm from a woman's point of view is written by Hildegard. And also, so much of her cosmology and her descriptions of the universe are supersexual. I mean, the entire basis of her sort of view of the world is to do with fecundity and reproduction is part of her cosmology. Her cosmology is about this greenness and these self-perpetuating systems, the function of which is to create worship for God. And so she's kind of like a very early ecologist. You know, the world is a network of these close relationships between people and animals and plants, and the lived world that must be sustained because the self-sustenance of these systems is put there by God in order to create the ability to worship Him, and existence is a form of worship. So, she's not. So it's quite interesting reading that side of her and these sort of the descriptions of human sexuality that she writes about. They're very thoughtful with these tropes that she uses of and like an aberrant sexual morality that's very close to what the church's opinion is.
Because it's very curious that she was kind of made part of the canon because there were a lot of mystics, and some were like condemned by the church, and some were embraced by the church. It's still very curious that she was
very, very curious.
Embraced by it.
And she was embraced by Bernard of Clairvaux, who was one of the most reactionary church figures of all time. The cheerleader of the Crusades was actually the person who gave her the permission to write the visions.
But what would be the reason? Because you said she was lucky, no? But what was that luck about? I mean,
I don't know. I don't know why she was chosen. I mean, there is definitely, after she starts to write them and she continues to have visions, after she starts to publish them rather than send them out to people, she continues to have visions, and the nature of those visions become more politically useful for her and the church. There is a tendency at one point in her life to meet some sort of internal political conflict in the church and to be a bit like, oh, I'm seeing something, it says you should do this or you should do that, which happens to align with their beliefs. There's a suggestion that there might be some cynical aspects towards some of her later visions. I don't know. The other thing, again, which refers to her, like her writing about sexuality, is the figure, like at that point in the Middle Ages, the church was actually had certain reputations for sex, for certain types of sexual behaviour. It wasn't seen as completely chaste, and actually politically you could write about sex and sexual immorality as a coded way to write about your problems with corruption in the church. Because corruption in the church was seen to go alongside the fact that a lot of priests and monks and even nuns were not chaste.
Okay. She was empowered by actually
and in writing about sexual immorality, she's actually making a critique of like wider theological, moral issues within the church.
In fact, the first time I came across the book, I heard some interview, and they were asking you probably something related to the queerness of her. So the queerness of this character, or Hildegard herself. And actually, I'm not totally sure that there is nothing queer. You know, it's difficult to translate the queerness.
About her?
Yeah. What do you think? I don't know.
I mean, first of all, it's very difficult to talk about someone in the past when we have so little documentary evidence of their life, about their personal relationships. Yeah. What we do know about her is that she had a very, very intimate relationship with Ignota, who was this woman who she was raised with, who was slightly older than her, maybe 5 years older than her, and she was put into her care when she was about 8 years old, so Ignota would be 13. and then they live together in one room for 15 years, 10, 15 years. And there's some interesting aspects of her biography and how it relates to Utah and the sense of pain that she had when she was far from Utah. And secondly, it's obviously impossible to retroactively describe relationships in the past using sexual identity today. I will say that like a lot of the writings about female sexuality are very vivid and not what you might expect from somebody who has supposedly been chaste and living in a convent, which might suggest, suggest something.
Yeah.
But that's a recurring motif in the idea of ecstasy and religious experience.
Yeah.
Motif.
And there's actually a very good essay by an American writer called Elvia Wilk about exactly this, about female mysticism and its relationship with the body and sexuality. And yeah, that's something that's recurrent. The idea that there's sort of I don't know how to say it. There's forms of sexual ecstasy that are religious ecstasy, and there is also forms of religious worship in the Middle Ages that have like very sexual forms to do with the Bride of Christ, and the relationship with Christ's wounds is not a big thing.
The cult of angels.
And the whole iconography of sacred art.
Yeah. And if you look up as well Hildegard's description of the universe, it's very chronological. Her description of it is,
But is her cosmology much different from the mainstream church cosmology, or
the idea of Viriditas, which is this sort of ecological system, like it's not heretical, but it's also not something you see at all described at the time or for a long time afterwards, in terms of a relationship with nature that is not, what's the word, like aggressive, not accumulative, predatory, or these things. Which I mean, I guess in the Bible it does say that everything was produced for humans to use, which is very not what she's saying at all.
very interesting?
Yeah, it's super interesting. Her life and the
And
story.
now for Alberta, how does this specific book relate to the self-care thing?
Actually,
I was very curious.
I was curious about the whole production of Ignota books, and they seems to like commission books that somehow have this strong bond with not just mysticism, but visionary narratives, and of course, what you can call mysticism. Yeah, let's say that. They also produce, for example, agendas, and you can go through all the weeks and days, and they suggest you spells and also practical thing to do with, candles, rituals, and also between the pages they tell you stories like Hildegard's ones. So I strongly wanted to include a book from Ignota, and not just talking about their production and the way they are commissioning somehow the books, to let you feel deeper, let's say, how this mysticism is translated in a project that can be a narrative or can be a diary. I strongly suggest to go on their website because they have amazing stuff, and you can also find very interesting. There is a book called Spells.
I have one that's very interesting about artificial intelligence and mysticism.
Yeah.
And parts of the book were written by a machine, which is quite interesting. It's a totally different approach of artificial intelligence that we have normally.
Totally.
And I really like this project. That's how I came here, because I saw your book on their website.
Yeah. Yeah, they write a lot about the esoteric and magic as a form of technology, and technology as a form of magic, the relationship between the two. And they're quite non-dogmatic about it, I think. They don't take an overly materialist view of the magic, and they don't take a sort of overly esoteric view of the technology as well. Like, it's technically quite...
It's an approach to spirituality that somehow can really help you to, get to know better yourself, and this practice where they can bring you and also hear the voice of characters like that, I think gives you strength to understand better some issues. So that's why. I don't know if I reply.
More provocation. That for me in a weird way it made a lot of sense with the Hammam
sometimes that's
thing.
like
It made a lot of sense for me. I just wanted to.
Pindaric, totally.
It made sense for me in a weird way. It was like
spirituality. That's what I wrote on the press release. Spirituality. I don't know if there are any other questions or curiosities. Oh, okay. So we can keep talking. Yeah. It's
Standing on the middle of the street.
Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for all of you.
great. Thank you so much.
Anna.